And thank you, Dr. Champel, for a really wonderful intro. You kind of gave the intro I was going to give. I was going to say real quick that I wrote my thesis as an argument for meaning-based interventions, and it was aimed at the mental health community, but I want to echo one of my personal heroes and inspirations in this work, someone who you'll hear a lot about tonight, Viktor Frankl, who wrote that when it comes to meaning, while it's an integral element to mental health practice, it's often the spiritual community leaders who do this work, so priests, rabbis, imams, etc., because it's an issue of the soul. So I hope that everyone here finds relevance in the concept as well. Mental health, yoga, and the role of meaning-based interventions. As Serenity so beautifully outlined, suffering is everywhere. As mental health practitioners, we see this in the growing numbers of people experiencing chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and particularly in the past year, isolation. We often witness two common outcomes of suffering that stand at opposite ends of a spectrum. And this comes from work done by Stanford researcher Jamil Zakai. He talks about how on the one hand, we often hear that hurt people, i.e. suffering becomes cyclical, cycles of trauma. On the other hand, many people who have experienced suffering go on to help others. For example, people that have experienced addiction going on to become rehab counselors, or survivors of sexual assault becoming crisis counselors. I'm sure we can all think of an example of someone like this from our own lives. Sakai notes that psychologists don't really know that much about what causes people when they experience suffering to go in one direction or another. But one important factor that they have identified is the support that we receive from other people. Connection is key. Essentially stating that those who move towards community, or at least towards an other, will have a greater chance at overcoming their suffering. The necessity being that they engage with someone or something, I will argue, outside of themselves. So based on this concept, I'll put my thesis statement here, but for the sake of time, in short, throughout my thesis, I will address both yogic and Western psychological practices for overcoming suffering through engagement in the world, as well as possible reasons that our current socio-political context fails to address community engagement as a potential resource for healing. So to start, we have to understand what is meaning from a psychological perspective. To understand meaning-based interventions and why they're relevant, why is meaning even important? The idea of meaning in Western psychology is predicated on Viktor Frankl's school of psychological counseling, logotherapy, that people are motivated by a search for meaning in their lives, what he calls a will towards meaning. And he places it in contrast to Freud's will to pleasure or Adler's will to power. So it's not actually an objective definition of life's meaning. That's not really the role of a mental health practitioner. What's important in this case is more about how the pursuit of meaning makes us feel. According to researcher Michael Steger, meaning provides us with three foundational principles. Our lives matter, our lives make sense, and we have a purpose or a basis for our aspirations and pursuits in life. And this is important because those feelings are often the ones that are lost in experiences of depression, anxiety, chronic stress, and isolation. These experiences lead us to feel hopelessness, that a person's existence doesn't matter or can't impact the world around them. So it becomes the role of a mental health practitioner to constantly and consistently remind our clients of these three foundational principles until they know them to be true in their hearts, that their lives matter,
they're doing
and that their lives have meaning, that your life has meaning. But how to go about helping someone feel that way? Spiritual traditions have a long sought to answer this question, and we can find support for meaning-based practices, engaged lifestyles that reinforce our mattering in the world from yogic philosophies. And I speak broadly here not to say that there's one singular yogic philosophical perspective. Yoga has roots in all the dharmic traditions of South Asia. So rather than attempting to claim a unified yogic perspective, I want to present how the texts that have influenced our modern yoga practice view the role of pursuing meaning through worldly engagement. What comes to mind first for me are the concepts of karma yoga, the yoga of action, and seva, selfless service. Both concepts are key philosophical concepts in the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu text often cited in discourse around worldly engagement. Just like there's not one mental health intervention that works for everyone, the Gita does not espouse one path for all spiritual aspirants. Karma yoga is simply a path for some, all paths leading to the same goal of liberation. And it says in the Gita, by meditating on the self, some see the self through the self. Others see by philosophical discipline, others by the discipline of action, karma yoga. Each path is specified in the Gita to those with particular characteristics. And the thing about karma yoga is that it is specifically associated with the active, rajasic types of people. The characteristic of rajas manifests as both an external physical activity as well as a tendency towards internal activity, a highly fluctuating and overactive mind, something we see often in mental health circles. And yet it's not any kind of action that works for the rajasic type. Self-interested action or even thoughtless action leads to suffering, while particular kinds of intentional action can be liberating. The actions that can lead to liberation are those without attachment to outcome. These actions must be done with an intention towards service for the sake of service. This understanding of the Gita supports the notion that transcendence can only be attained by moving beyond the self. These are the actions that connect individuals to a larger reality. In my paper, I dive into the way that Gandhi further revolutionized the concept of karma yoga by bringing together spiritual action and political action. And while Gandhi's incorporation of personal spiritual practice and worldly political action was revolutionary at the time, this integrated path towards liberation is not unique to the Bhagavad Gita. The dynamic between personal spiritual liberation and worldly engagement can be understood more completely by understanding the approaches of Buddhist and Jain thought as well. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a key text in modern yoga philosophy, are commonly understood as a composite text of philosophies from Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, and they outline various paths towards liberation. Like the Bhagavad Gita, the sutras do not require one specific path. Rather, they outline various options for various types of practitioners. According to the sutras, when one experiences the accompanying distractions and impediments to yoga of discomfort, depression, trembling of the body, and disturbed inhalation and exhalation, one can avoid the significance of these obstacles by the implementation of just one of the following truths, and gets to be of a serene disposition and good humor when one takes an attitude of friendliness towards the pleasant, compassion to those who suffer, joy for the meritorious, and of equanimity towards attitudes are necessarily in relationship to another. They require one to interact with another person and treat them a certain way. These are engaged practices. And they're not that different from what meaning-based therapies advocate for. As a psychiatrist in the Holocaust who lived through the concentration camps, Viktor Frankl observed how having a sense of purpose outside of oneself could act as a life-sustaining quality through horrific atrocities and seemingly hopeless experiences. He describes how in concentration camp life, when a prisoner had given up their will to meaning, they would smoke a cigarette, one they had kept hidden deep within their pockets that they had been saving. This act of giving in to the desire for pleasure meant that they had given up hope, that they no longer found meaning in existence. Within 48 hours, Frankl attested that that prisoner would be dead. As Frankl famously quotes Nietzsche, one who knows the why for existence will be able to bear almost any how. Based on this notion, Frankl devised a school of psychology called logotherapy. The school of therapy that attempts to alleviate suffering by encouraging patients to pursue meaningful engagements. Frankl's school of therapy runs counter to the mindset of happiness promoted in the US. In his discussion on the meaning of suffering, he quotes the research of Dr. Weiskopf-Schulson, who writes that our current mental hygiene philosophy stresses the idea that people ought to be happy, that unhappiness is a symptom of maladjustment. Such a value system may be responsible for the fact that the burden of unavoidable happiness is increased by unhappiness about being unhappy. Logotherapy acts appropriately here because the ultimate goal of logotherapy is to help a person realize their responsibility in life. Frankl writes, and I think this might be the most important thing I say tonight, that the more one forgets themselves by giving themselves to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human they are, and the more they actualize themselves. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Essentially, Frankl is stating that in order to live a meaningful and actualized life, one must transcend themselves. They must engage with the world around them. Meaning requires one to see themselves as part of a greater picture. The issue is that meaning-based therapies arose in response to a mainstream approach to psychological intervention, which fails to acknowledge or deal with an individual's greater reality. While meaning-based therapies exist, they're still not popular, and they're still not the norm in mental health counseling. For the same reason I'm about to discuss, that engaged practices are not always practiced in modern yoga. The sense of meaning that mental health practitioners should try to instill in others, according to a meaning-based approach, is often what drives people to yoga practice. And yet we have to question if the modern practices are really serving that need. When we as mental health practitioners recommend yoga or meditation, are those practices going to help people transcend their suffering, transcend themselves? Our world of modern yoga has grown up within a culture of neoliberalism and rugged individualism. This is a culture that shifts the responsibility for public welfare from the state to the private realms of individual. And this is an issue that is evidently much greater than the world of yoga, but to which yoga inherently belongs. As issues of health become a responsibility of the individual, matters of accessibility to health-related practices become the predicament of excluded individuals rather than the responsibility of the society. As health turns into an issue of the individual, individuals are encouraged into constant, really truly constant self-improvement projects. We see this all around in the modern yoga world, the body as the singular location for transcendence, the complete responsibility of the individual, and a dedication to never ending self-improvement projects on the body. And why is this important for meaning-based interventions? It means that yoga, as a potential tool for transcendence, currently lives in a culture where responsibility is promoted not towards others, but to the self and the self alone, and to the self constantly. The issue is of extreme importance to mental health practitioners attempting to use yoga as a form of intervention. While our modern yoga practice absolutely provides a necessary mental respite from the world and means to better understand ourselves, the practice seems to end there. A culture of individualism leads directly to a culture void of interpersonal responsibility. As I just outlined, this can happen on the level of policy and healthcare, where individuals are expected to take responsibility for their own health, leaving poor and marginalized communities without resources, completely in the dust. And might I say, this is true of this context as well, of the modern yoga world. But this can also happen on the level of the individual, and in this case, the individual yoga practitioner. The act of voiding responsibility in deference to personal spiritual practice is called spiritual bypass. And research has shown that in most instances, spiritual bypass is inversely related to health and wellness. It's considered more of a defense mechanism than anything else. So it's kind of like this shield that removes people from reality, and most importantly, removes their sense of responsibility to care for others' suffering. Even further, spiritual bypass mixed with a culture obsessed with self-improvement gives birth to spiritual narcissism, what researcher Scott Barry Kaufman calls the "I'm enlightened and you're not" syndrome. He writes that this is a form of transcendence that is actually a pseudo-transcendence built on a very shaky foundation, and rather than transcending the self, one might end up accidentally transcending everything but the self. Dr. Robert Masters writes that when the process of transcendence is healthy, what's been transcended is not excluded from our being any more than clouds are excluded from the sky. When transcendence is unhealthy, what has been transcended is excluded from our being, resulting in escapism and disconnection. Now, that is not to say that we should only care for others and not care for ourselves. Self-care is important, and the concept itself has incredibly important roots in our modern framework. It was a term popularized by people of color and women during the civil rights movement as tools for survival in a country that consistently devalued their lives. This practice is obviously still incredibly relevant, where this year, BIPOC and trans communities have to shout in the streets that their lives matter. And yet the practice itself has been co-opted and commodified. In 2001, after 9/11, the president of this country encouraged people to go shopping. Caring for the self in moments of suffering is encouraged through consumerism and a hyper focus on the self rather than an engagement with the self in relation to others. Self-care has become the end goal rather than a means to recharge and re-engage. We often preach in mental health spaces to fill your cup because you can't pour from an empty cup. But does this metaphor make sense in a society that rarely encourages pouring? What is needed now in a mental health practice? What is needed now is a mental health practice that acknowledges individuals' larger reality and even further encourages them to take action within their realities, to help others or to dedicate themselves to a cause. And this is not to ignore the self or practices pertaining to self-care. This is only to say that those practices have to be a means, not an ends. And they're currently so overemphasized within our modern frameworks of mental health care and spiritual care. It is my hope that as mental health practitioners, if we encourage people to pursue meaning in the world through active engagement, We might also be able to provide a seat of respite for the marginalized communities that have been fighting to be seen and to matter. At the end of the day, it is a balance of self-care and community care that is needed. Right now, we need to tip the scale a little. Our modern frameworks for both mental health and yoga state that the responsibility for health is on each individual. Meaning-based therapies state that our responsibility is towards each other. Our modern framework encourages a cycle of self-care and work. Be healthy and care for yourself so you can continue working. Meaning-based therapies encourage a cycle of communal care, where self-care is only a means to better care for others. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gavi. That was very powerful, very important, and very honest. And both of our speakers thus far have talked about the dangers of spiritual bypass, a danger that Patanjali actually identifies in the fourth pada of the Yoga Sutra, where he states that trying to put on this spiritual thing just never suffices. So I would like to open this up for a few questions, and if perhaps Gavi could monitor the chat, or if you would like to just get our attention and speak up.
Gavi, what was your inspiration or points of inspiration for going in this direction out of all the possible directions you could have gone with your thesis?
Francesca was up.
Okay.
Thank you, Francesca. It's hard to say what my inspiration was. I have been, I don't know if I would say a student of Viktor Frankl. I consider him almost like a good friend, you know, someone who accompanies you when you've read them so much. Since I was young, he was probably the first author I read that I felt truly so inspired by. I think everything I've done in my life, from studying psychology till now, has been inspired by his work. So I don't know. I think that inspiration struck a long time ago. But I do hope to continue pursuing meaning-based therapies as a way to help people. I think the spark for this was ignited a long time ago.
Gavi, do you have some recommendations for encouraging communal care in a group setting?
Teresa, can you say that again? You went in and out.
Oh, sure, no problem. Hopefully I won't this time. So if you were working with a group, do you have any techniques or exercises that you'd recommend to help exercise communal care in a group setting?
I think the most important part, and you know, the practices part is what I hope to keep studying. So I don't have a complete answer for you, but I do think the most important part is truly just small steps towards action. So considering for every individual, what are your communities? What people are you surrounded by? Where can you act in small ways, right? We often feel, I think, hopelessness because the world is really big and we want to change the whole thing. And so thinking small really helps, because community change is incredibly important.
Thank you.
Gabby, here. I loved your presentation. I'm also a fan of Viktor Frankl. And I was wondering, in the formula that you're using in your application, how do you propose suggesting attitude as Viktor presents that choice?
That's the hardest one. To change your attitude is so challenging. I think the approach of Viktor Frankl and the approach of, most anything that could be considered a cognitive behavioral therapy, or, a lot of yoga practices, that you change action to change the way that you feel, because it's really hard to change the way that you feel, even if you want to, even if there's a desire. And so generally, and I think meaning-based therapies and a lot of yoga practice too could be seen in that kind of CBT way, where you change action as a way to change a feeling.
Yeah, it's hard to get to the place of understanding choice until you kind of get through that, isn't it? That's great. Great, great, great ideas. Great ideas. I love your presentation.
Thank you so much. There's a really wonderful question in the chat, and I don't want to say your name wrong. Indu Subramanian.
Yeah. Hi.
Asked, hi, thank you so much for the question. Can I read it, or do you want to read it?
Yeah, I mean,
say it?
Yeah, sure. That was a really excellent talk. So I'm a neurologist, and I treat Parkinson's patients mostly at the VA. And a lot of what we talk about is, getting the patient to engage in things like that give them self-efficacy on sort of this path to wellness. The notion that you're in control of your own destiny as a patient, and sort of thinking about all the modifiable variables and health lifestyle choices that you may have to feel better has been important, I think, in, not just physical health, but mental health as well. So I was really intrigued by what you said, though, about, some of the populations that we serve that may not actually be able to make easily those choices. And I think, we want to give patients an ability to choose, but then also we have to respect the fact that they may not have everything in their means to choose. I think also society has to provide some things, and the community that they live in has to provide some things. And you obviously have to take into account where they're living, the family life and all the other things. So I was just trying to figure out how you balance those two kind of, I think, seemingly polar, sort of opposite maybe interests when you're thinking about healthcare. Were you able to hear that? Sorry.
I think you gave a really good almost answer to your own question. I think it's really complicated, because as mental health practitioners, right, you want to help people feel a sense of responsibility. It's very important to feel that we can make a difference, and at the same time, there's so many systemic issues that we have very little ability to control. And I think the ability to feel, though, that we can make an impact can happen small. It's maybe in relationships, but it's definitely something that is what's the word, a kind of like a cultural competency almost of a mental health practitioner, to be able to understand what contexts are we working in, what is available to people, what systemic issues are they dealing with, because those obviously are very much feel like really huge world problems that we can't always impact just through our day-to-day changes, unfortunately.
Yeah. Great talk.